In 1991, David Denby went back to school. The film critic for a New York magazine returned to his alma mater, Columbia University, to observe, sit in, 2 courses he had taken 30 years earlier. Literature, Humanities, and Contemporary Civilization were the courses. Great Books is a compilation of the notes he took in class on his favorite rediscovered books. Joining me now is David Denby on his return from the classroom, and I am pleased to have him here. Welcome.
Thank you.
This is America, the book that I've been teasing David about for a long time because he'd been writing it for 5 years, and whenever he would come on the show to talk about movies, I would say, where's the book? Because the publisher wants to know where the book. Well, I must tell you, America, the publisher is very happy because this book is getting rave reviews across the country. People are saying extraordinary things about it, and what I like about it is that it is new in terms of its idea and the ideas that it treats and the ideas that it approaches and the books that it examines are old and true. So with that note, I'm pleased to have David Denby here for a conversation about great books. Welcome, sir.
Pleased to be here.
Congratulations.
Yes. Sure you don't want to talk about Arnold Schwarzenegger? Sylvester Stallone?
What movies might we see in the fall?
Well,
we'll have that conversation with you and Janet.
Yes.
There is Plato, and there is King Lear, and there is Rousseau, and there is Homer, and there are many others.
Yeah.
Tell me about this, because it seems to, did it begin, as some suggest, out of a midlife crisis?
Well, there is an element of that. I was 47, 48, beginning to feel a little stale, perhaps, a little tired of being entirely in the media culture, and I felt I had a lot of opinions and attitudes, and I didn't really know anything anymore, and I was sort of secondhand. Everything was secondhand, and I wanted to get back to basics and read seriously again. I was a little middle-aged blase, perhaps. No doubt about it. And there's a therapeutic side to this, except instead of 12 steps, it's 1,000 steps. You know, it's incremental. You get a little piece of insight. You struggle a little bit. I was exhilarated the whole time, the whole 5 years. I pressed against the frame of my life every day that I was doing this, when I was taking the course for a year, 2 courses, and when I was writing, because I was pushing. It was hard.
Pushing to do what? To examine the ideas?
First, just to read seriously. I mean, when I was 16, 17, I used to sit there in my parents' apartment and read hour after hour, and then play with the quilt. Oh, this is a red thread, there's a green thread, back to Dickens, you know, another 2 hours. I can't do that anymore. Partly it's because my life is more complicated, and I've got kids running around and everything, but I also think all that media that I've swallowed has had, you know, there's a much richer kind of experience, but there's my attention has snapped. So to sit down and read a 15,693 line poem, which is what the Iliad is, I think I got the numbers right, it was very, very difficult at first. And it was very difficult to read German philosophy. It was like climbing a mountain. I kept slipping down, and oh God, now, you know, I've got to get back into gear here, and when you got to the top of the mountain, it was really exciting. It was one of the great pleasures of my life, yeah.
You felt what?
I felt like a total joy that I had done something very difficult. And then the classroom experience was very exciting, too. And, of course, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. That was the problem. I was going to sit there and observe and let the 18 and 19-year-olds do all the work.
You see, here's what's interesting. A lot of people would suggest to you and to the world, I think it was, I don't know who it was, but someone once said, you know, you really shouldn't read Tolstoy until you're 30. Because you can't understand and appreciate necessarily the kinds of issues and the kinds of things and the kinds of experiences he's talking about. Whether that's true or not, it is certainly true that more of us should appreciate going back and dealing with these things, because they're dealing with all of the basic emotions of life, what is honest, integrity, and honor, and friendship, and betrayal, and life, and death, and character, and love.
One of the good things about turning 50, the only good thing about turning 50, is that you're not squeamish about talking about those things as you are when you're younger. You make fun of it when you're younger. You're ironic, you're distant, it's a joke, you don't want to be square. It's a relief to not be afraid to talk about those things. I mean, I talked about the death of my mother, I talked about how I'm going to raise my children. Each of these books, in their way, is very extreme. King Lear is an extreme work. The Book of Job is an extreme work. Nietzsche's philosophy. It brought me up against the frame of my life. I had to say, who am I? What do I really want? What have I done? What have I not done? What have I avoided?
And let me ask some of those questions. When you ask yourself, who am I? What did you come to? What kind of conclusion?
Well, I came to a much stronger feeling for my work, and my family. Things that I tended in other areas like friendship, things that I tended to think were secondary became much more important to me. I cared more for the work I was doing. Even movie reviewing meant more to me rather than less to me. I thought it might destroy the movies, and it didn't.
You thought it might seem to you at the end of this sort of not up to your, or somebody, not worthy of your attention?
That's not it. I mean, it didn't happen that way. I just became more disgusted with movies that were made without any commitment to, you know, any risk, any courage, any faith in the audience, any real desire even to entertain. And it's not that I said, oh, now I've got to go rush back and read Sophocles. Well, seeing a bad action movie made me want to see a great action movie. It sharpened my desire for pleasure and for more complex pleasures, which I think is what education is all about. These kids coming out of a media society, they're used to very shallow pleasures, and I'm not against shallow pleasure. You know, I'm a movie critic. They've got to be taken by the hand and led into the labyrinth of these more difficult pleasures, which is what a great work of art is.
But can you do it by taking them by the hand?
You take them by the hand and help them to read, because many of them, they're extremely bright, but they are not obsessive readers, even at these elite universities. They get there, they know movies, they know music, they do not know books. They haven't been asked to read that much literature in high school.
What did you get from the interaction with classmates who were considerably younger than you are?
Well, they read in a different way, and sometimes they read better than me, and sometimes they read worse. When we got to the Book of Job, they read it, I think, properly as a spiritual story and a test of faith. And I read it, and here was this guy who was about my age, perhaps, and had a lot of, you know, sheep and goats and tents and lost everything, and I got very upset. I read it, in other words, a kind of material way. I thought of friends who had been downsized out of work or had died of AIDS, and in that case, I think the students were right. And when we got to Oedipus, they couldn't deal with it because here was this brilliant man who commits terrible crimes. He sleeps with his mother and kills his father. And they thought it was just entirely unfair. The gods had plotted out this fate for him. And what I saw was, here's a brilliant guy who's cut off from some part of himself. When Oedipus finally finds out what he did, he blinds himself. And so the ruling metaphor here is blindness. And I thought, God, you know, the very drive for success, the very drive for dominance, which I undergo, like anyone else, cuts you off from some part of yourself, makes you blind in some way. I've never known a powerful person who really understood himself. In other words, blindness is necessary to the powerful in some way. That was a sort of a shock, but I couldn't explain that to an 18-year-old. That you have to learn on your own. You have to go through that to know that. And then with King Lear, they're still subject to their parents' power, you know, when they're 19 or 20. They haven't gone through that awful transformation we all have to go through when we have to take care of our parents. And we don't know how to do it. I mean, it's one of the tragedies of life that you're not prepared for. You can read for it, you'll never be prepared for it. But that play is about that transformation, how you handle it.
Of all the things that you read and all the stories and all of the great works, what had the most profound was it Lear? What had the most profound influence?
I think Lear, yeah, because I thought of my own mother. And she was Lear-like in her capacities. She was brilliant and great. She was a terrific businesswoman. And then when my father died, and she demanded more love from me than I could give her, just as King Lear demands of his daughters. And she became irrational. She also had an illness, we later found out, that we didn't know about. But I didn't always handle these new responsibilities particularly well, and I didn't really understand it until I read the play again the second time, and then it all became clear. And I had a painful few days there, because I felt I had fallen short in some ways. So, I mean, this is why it was exhilarating. The pain can be exhilarating too, in the sense that sometimes what you learn isn't so pleasant about yourself. But a lot of the time, I was just excited to be dealing with big ideas and you know, great works. Just a tremendous thrill.
You dedicate it to your parents.
I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
But your wife is also a writer.
She is indeed, Kathleen Shaw.
And what did she benefit from all of this?
She provoked me into writing it, because I was complaining about the culture wars in the late 80s. I was bored with both left and right. The academic left seemed, you know, complaining that Western classics empowered white males and disempowered everybody else. This seemed to me a crazy way to talk about works of art and literature. And people like Bennett and Cheney were discussing literature as if it were somehow a bulwark of our national defense, rather like Star Wars or something. And I thought, gee, have these people read what does it really mean to read Shakespeare? What does it mean to read, you know, Hegel or Kant? So I was carrying on as I do, and she said, you know, stop complaining.
Do something.
Do something about it. And we thought it was a
her.
magazine article,
Yeah.
you know, like 5,000 word piece in the Atlantic Monthly, and I got up there and started to listen, and then I got a book contract, and, you know, it was, this is 200,000 words.
The book contract was your idea. Did you, after going through this process, I mean, which you did without intending to write a book?
No, I did.
You did.
Once I decided, once I went up there and listened, I realized it was a book.
Yeah.
My agent said, go up there and pretend you're writing it now. See if you're really turned on. I came back quivering with excitement after sitting in on a few classes, and I wrote up a proposal. So
this is Kathy Robbins, isn't it?
Yes, Kathy Robbins, great agent.
And so you went up there.
I was introduced to Kathy Robbins by Joe Klein. And
who was anonymous, as we know. And
always knew it was
You
Joe.
always knew?
Yeah, but all of us at New York Magazine knew because we knew his style and preoccupations. Just read the first paragraph of the thing, you know. But I tried to say to him once, don't overplay your hand, but I couldn't say it because I knew he'd scream at me the way he screamed at everyone else. Yeah. Anyway.
And so then the story came out, and and everybody says, how could you lie to your friends?
Yes, he did overplay his
back
hand.
writing. And
he's a very good writer. He's a brilliant writer.
Back to this.
Sure.
So what about people who, I mean, if I listen to this conversation and I say, damn, what an idea. You know,
how do you do it?
How do I do it? Do I go back to school, or do I read Denby's book? And is Denby's book going to be, for me, a kind of guide, an introduction into how do I acquaint myself with the great books and the great ideas of Western civilization?
I think it's a pretty fair guide to some key works in Western civilization. It's organized by author, first semester, second semester. Literature stuff and philosophy and political theory. I think I quote liberally, so I give you a good idea of the flavor of each. I hate writers who don't quote. A flavor of each of these people, and then, because the message is go thou and do likewise, as you're saying. And now, how do you do it? Well, it's not so easy. You're busy, you've got, you know, complicated life, you've got children pulling at you. Well, one way is to form a group. A group of like-minded friends. Because there are a lot of reading groups in the country. Women, in particular. Men, you know, when they get together, they have to discuss sports or politics. It's unmanly to discuss a book, which of course is ridiculous.
There are more and more book groups getting together to talk about books. I see there's a lot around the country.
That's what's keeping publishing going. So you could do it with a group of friends. But one person would have to play teacher for each text, all right? It's your turn next week, Charlie. You're going to work up a little background on Nietzsche. It's not hard to find this stuff. You know, you can get it at any good bookstore. You can use my book as a way in, and then you take on the book and you sort of lead the discussion. It would be fun.
How did it change you? You come out of this more secure, more.
I think I come out of it more intellectually secure, more precise. I know a little more. I'm able to frame arguments more clearly simply by watching the students doing it and by forcing myself to do it. I'm glad I wrote it, and you know, when you write something, you really learn it. My pleasures, as I say, are sharpened. I'm more demanding, perhaps, of movies and of many other things. And I am I'm dying to read all the rest of it.
That was that's what I'm leading to. Did you find a roadmap to new pleasures from writers that you didn't know or knew about, but didn't experience truly and didn't feel? It's like, listening but not hearing.
Exactly. There was that case, and then there were also slightly different reading lists from 30 years prior, because like women are in there for the first time. I had not liked Virginia Woolf when I was a kid. I thought it was all amorphous. Now that I read it as a grown-up, To the Lighthouse, I thought it was extraordinary, and I want to read the rest that I haven't read. The Boccaccio I knew only from sort of retellings of his stories in Playboy, you know, and they used to publish them in the 50s. I would steal a magazine from under a counselor's bed at camp and read it. Well, the Playboy editing sort of killed the fluency of his style. But I'm delivered back to my 16-year-old reading habits. Now I just have to find a little more time. But I've recovered my concentration and my desire that I had when I was a kid, that sort of ecstatic relationship you have with literature when you're young.
I once had a friend who would never read a book that wasn't 10 years old.
Well,
for some reason,
not
had that kind of judgment about
things. He couldn't have been a talk show host, but...
politically correct.
Yes.
Where do you come down in terms of this, in terms of what some call an attack on a blinded look to Western civilization for all that is wise and smart?
I suppose the whole book is politically incorrect.
Right.
I heard expressions of political correctness in the classroom. The students are much nicer than we were 30 years earlier. They are genuinely tolerant. They want to be genuinely tolerant of one another. They don't like the trash talk that they hear on lousy radio programs. They don't like ethnic bantering. You know, what the trouble is...
But the students at Columbia University are not necessarily a reflection of the
that's true.
Population.
But they, if anything, they err on the side of blandness, and this is where the political correctness comes in. For instance, they won't venture, and I discuss this all the way through, any kind of generalization about any cultural group whatsoever. So if you say something merely factual, such as there's a higher than normal crime rate in the inner cities, they back away from that because they think you're going to put down black people. And you're talking about a cultural condition that everyone knows about, and I talk about being mugged, and when I get to some of the social theory, people like Hobbes, what holds a society together, what pulls it apart. And I try to talk about these things in class. I would bring them up, and I ran into a couple of stone walls there. Is that students...
Did you come away from all this reading with authors that you didn't like, the people that you just didn't enjoy?
I failed several times, and I try to be candid about this. I absolutely refused a kind of, you know, the attitude of blanket piety before the classes.
Oh, these are great.
That would kill the book faster than anything. And when I was bored or when it didn't work, I said so. I wrote a whole chapter in which I'm struggling with Dante's Inferno.
Yeah.
I just had terrible trouble accepting that medieval worldview where people were damned to eternal torment, and Dante is extremely explicit about the torments forever for sleeping with a good-looking neighbor or, you know, fixing a parking ticket.
This book is called Great Books. It is by David Denby. We will have David back here to talk about this more, because you cannot reach in and get all that is here in one session. I look forward to having him back this fall, and we'll talk more about a book that's getting a lot of attention. The New York Times reviewed by Joyce Carol Oates, and many others have said really wonderful things about it. In Vogue magazine, Denby's Great Books begins in disillusion, essentially a diary of the author's modulated response to midlife crisis. Denby fights to rescue the book from boredom and relevance from the current misshavelings as mere clubs and speeds in an ideological war, and talks about the debate about the Western canon. It is a great, great idea, well handled by David Denby. I'm pleased to have you here.
Thanks, Charlie.
We'll come back and talk more about it. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.